Hello, everybody. It's the 4th of July, and in the United States, that's a holiday. It naturally made me think of the American flag, how it's full of interesting geometric shapes, and what a perfect candidate it is for building using shape layers in After Effects. So this is kind of a follow-up tutorial to the one I just released about working with shape layers, and I'm making it available to everybody above the early access pledge level, just in case you're interested in another sample of what kind of stuff I offer in the tutorial level. And if you have followed the tutorials, this is a legitimate sequel because I want to get into some techniques we didn't really cover. In the last video, we kind of played jazz and we're just making things up as we went along, but I wanted to get into more efficient and precise ways of working with shapes. And the Wikipedia entry for the United States flag actually has a section with the exact specifications, government-approved specs for a proper US flag. So I thought, why don't we do this as an exercise on creating something based on very specific instructions? So let's get into it. First of all, I've been a little bit annoyed that shape layers are the one kind of layer that doesn't have its own keyboard shortcut. It's kind of annoying that you have to go into this menu. So a useful keyboard shortcut to know is Command-Alt-, because that's the keyboard shortcut for keyboard shortcuts. It's the panel where all of them are assigned, modified, and added. We can just go into Shape Layers. There isn't a shortcut, but we can add one. Let's do some weird combination that isn't used. How about Control-Command-Shift-A? That's not too hard to press. So now we don't have to go into the menu and we can just press Alt-Command-Shift-A and have a shape layer right there. Let's get in there and immediately create a rectangle because flags are rectangular usually. And as previously with our logo, let's bump it up to 1,000 to make it nice and huge. There's another benefit to using 1,000 in this case, because all these specs are actually given as like a ratio in relation to the hoist of the flag, otherwise known as the height. So the height is 1, and everything else is like a fraction of that. That's good for us because if we use 1,000, we can just mentally move the decimal 3 places to the right on all these numbers and plug them in directly. So for example, for the width, it says 1.9. So for us, that means 1900. I'll just unhook the proportions and type 1900 in here. And look at that. It fits just snugly inside the comp, almost as if I arranged this in advance. So what's the next easiest thing to construct? Well, there's this other rectangle, the blue part, which apparently is called the canton. That wasn't on my US citizenship test, but learn something new every day. We're getting smarter every day. So let's create another rectangle, and for its dimensions, the width is supposed to be 0.76, so that means 760. And the height is 538.5. 538.5. Very good. Next, we need to position it in the right place. Now, this rectangle is going to contain its blue color, the shape of the stars, and the color of the stars. So it's going to be several elements, all of which are going to be part of the canton. So it makes sense to group it. And in the last video, we would go in here and create a group and put the thing we want to group in there. But there's a much more efficient way of just selecting the thing you want to group and pressing Command-G. Then a group is created and the object is deposited in there. That saves a lot of time. So I'll just rename this group Canton, and I'll put it above the overall flag rectangle. Now it would take us mere seconds to just use the position of the group to kind of place it into the upper left-hand corner like this. But that's not exactly precise. If we go in here, it's not going to line up perfectly and we're going to need to like jog it, and it's difficult to get it perfectly right. I want to use the power of grade school arithmetic to get it precise. First, it would help us if the anchor point of this rectangle was in the upper left-hand corner. Right now it's in the middle, which is 0, 0. So what we want to do is move it upward, which is negative, exactly half the height of the rectangle, and then to the left, which is also negative, exactly half the width. So, in case you're unaware, you can type in math expressions into these fields. So if I took, for example, the height number from here and copied it with Command-C, I can go in here, type -1 times, so that the resulting number is going to be negative, and then in parentheses, paste that height number and divide it by 2. Close parentheses. And then we get the exact number we need, which lines us up with the top edge. We'll do the same thing for the horizontal position of the anchor point. -1 times, in parentheses, 760, which is the width, divided by 2, gets us into the corner. Now we'll use the same trick to position the actual group up into this corner. So we'll look at the size of the overall flag And I guess I should be able to do that in my head, but -1 times 1900 divided by 2, that's minus 950. I can do half of 1,000 in my head, that's 500, -500 in our case. And we've got the canton in the correct place. What's next? There's stars in there, so let's create a star. Let's highlight the canton group so the star ends up inside of it, and add a polystar. Now it's a 5-pointed star, which is what the flag has, but if you look carefully, the flag stars look a little bit different. It's the kind of star where the top edge of the left and right arms form like a perfect horizontal line. If we look in here, the way that this kind of shape is achieved is that the outer radius is exactly twice the inner radius. The inner is 50 and the outer is 100. But if I move the inner radius around to make it look like the stars on the flag, it looks like it's 38 to 100, a 0.38 to 1 ratio. So let's keep that in mind. Our star is too big right now, and we need to make it the correct size. So what is the correct size? Here it's given as K, or the diameter of a star, which is 0.0616. So for us, that means 61.6. But this is diameter. Here we've got a radius. We'll type 61.6, but divided by half, because radius is half the diameter, right? And that shrinks it so much that the outer radius is now smaller than the inner radius. Remember, we determined that the inner radius is 0.38, so we'll copy this outer radius number, paste it in here, and multiply it by 0.38. And that gives us the correct shape again. Next order of business is to actually move it in the correct place. This will be our initial star in the upper left-hand corner. We already know that the anchor point of the group is in the upper left-hand corner, so if we highlight it and copy it, and then paste it into the position of the star snaps right into the upper left-hand corner. We need it to be offset inside of the rectangle. It says here that the horizontal margin and the spacing between all the stars is the same, 63.3, and same with the vertical spacing, which is 53.8. We'll go into the position, click in here, and to the number that it already is at, we will add 63.3, then press Tab to go into the next field, and to this one we will add 53.8. And that pushes it to the right and down into the exact position that it needs to be in. Now that took a few steps. I don't want to create and resize and reposition the star 50 times like this. Luckily, we don't have to. Instead, we can use the repeater, this thing right here, to just clone the stars as much as we need. But, as we know from the last video, the repeater is one of these modifiers that are in this last bunch. And just as you can't really see a fill or a stroke unless you created a shape, you can't really see the effect of these modifiers unless you have some kind of visual attribute. Because it doesn't really add any geometry or change anything in the vector lines, it just creates a visual illusion. That's a long way of saying our star needs a fill color. So if I add a fill into the canton group, it actually fills the entire group. And we already know from the last video that in order to limit its effect, we need to subgroup it. So I'll select the star and the fill and press Command G and rename that stars because it'll contain all of the stars. Let's go in and change the fill color to white. We might as well. Now we're ready to duplicate the stars. Let's highlight the stars group, add the repeater. And right away, our star gets cloned a couple of times. If we open the repeater's properties, we see the number of copies. Note that it's 3, meaning 3 altogether, the original star plus 2 duplicates. So my plan is to use the repeater to make the entire row of stars, then use a second repeater to repeat all the rows downward until we have the entire matrix of stars. The only thing to consider is that on the flag, the stars are not in a straight grid. It's sort of a checkerboard pattern. And we can tackle that by just making 2 different arrays and offsetting them. In other words, what we'll do is create every other star, all the odd numbered stars, and then the other ones in between. This first row is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's set the number of copies to 6. And the distance of the offset, you might think this offset controls how much they're spaced out, but actually the offset is something else. It sort of jumps it to a different spot in the row. The thing that controls the spacing is kind of unintuitive. It's down in the transform properties of the repeater, and it's the position. You see it's automatically set to 100 by default. If it was set to 0, then all the copies would be on top of each other and you wouldn't know that anything happened. But what is the distance that we need to set this to? Well, it says here that the spacing is 63.3, but remember that we're making every other star right now. So we'll type in 63.3, but multiply it by 2, and that gives us the exact positioning. Now we can collapse the repeater, duplicate it, go into the options here. This time we don't want to repeat it to the right anymore, so we'll set that back down to 0. And instead we'll be repeating it downward. And I remember that that was 53.8, but again we need to multiply that by 2. And that gives us the right spacing vertically, but we do end up with one extra row because vertically there's only 5 stars. Let's click in here and press the down arrow key to reduce it by 1. Nice. Now that we have this whole array of the odd stars, we can take the initial star and the 2 repeaters that make it up and group that. I'm not going to include the fill because I want the fill to apply to all the stars that we make, so it can stay outside. But Command G to group this, and I'll just call this odd. Duplicate the group, call these ones even, and then open it up. And since the position of the initial star controls the whole bunch, we could just offset that. So again, we'll take the position, and in the horizontal field, we'll add, what was it, 63.3? And vertically, we add 53.8. That staggers them correctly, but again, we end up with an extra row and an extra column. So let's go into the repeaters and just knock that down by 1. And that gives us all the stars. We might as well add the background blue to the canton. Fill, let's set it to some kind of blue color. Looks good. Now we'll just finish up with the rest of the background on the flag. The idea is that it's 13 stripes for the original 13 colonies. The red is a stripe and the white is a stripe. But of course, for constructing it makes more sense to just have a background color and then intermittent stripes of the other color. So I think I'll make the background white. In order to build all this, we should group the big rectangle as well. So Command G, I'll call this BG, I guess, for background, and add that fill color in there, set it to white. And now let's add a stripe. So another rectangle. We know it stretches the length of the flag, which is 1900, and the width of the stripe is this final number, which is 76.9. 76.9. The stripes will need a color of their own, so again, I need to group this, call this stripes, move it above the rectangle, and add a fill. And for once, the default red color is the color that we need. Now we should position this initial stripe up at the top so we can clone it downward across the flag. So if I set it to -500, that'll line up the center of the stripe with the top edge. I just need to push it down the exact half of its width. We'll add 76.9 divided by 2. No need for parentheses there because of order of operations, right? And now it lines up perfectly with the top edge, and it's ready for the repeater. So once again, a repeater. We'll go into the options, go into the transform. We don't need it to repeat horizontally, set that to 0. And the vertical displacement will be 76.9, the width of a stripe, but multiplied by 2 because we're skipping every other stripe. So we'll just click in here and increase it till it reaches the edge of the flag. And that's all of it, I believe. Just as in the previous exercise, we'll search for color properties, and then they've got the actual official colors, or the RGB equivalents of them. So the white is pure white, which is what we already have. But for the red, they've got this number, which I can just copy, click on the red, paste it right in. Do the same thing for the blue, paste, and we're done. So once again, we can call this US flag, and we can save it as an animation preset. Maybe we can build up a library of other nations' flags and use them in like all kinds of motion graphics. Or in our case, I guess, for making some sort of celebratory animation, let's say turbulent displace, something to make the flag look like it's waving proudly. I'll animate the offset of the distortion, perhaps pre-compose it, turn it into a 3D layer, add a 3D camera with Alt-Command-Shift-C. Create a subtle animation, and maybe add something for the background, like some kind of sky blue color, and maybe another shape layer where we can add, say, a star again, but give it a whole bunch of points, make it really large, round out its edges so that it looks like rays of light. Give it a nice, happy, warm color. Add a quick expression to the rotation, like time times 20. And another solid with a gradient ramp, which will set to radial, center it, stretch it out a bit, swap the colors, change its blend mode to something more interesting, and dial in the brightness. Maybe even add a curves adjustment to control that fall off of that gradient. And then another adjustment layer with the curves to kind of not let the background outshine our bright flag. And it's ready to be the backdrop of any used car dealership commercial on local television all over the nation. So this is just another look at what shape layers allow you to do. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.